Welcome to a jointly organized panel with Zahid Zulfikar Ali Bhutto Institute of Science and Technology. The European Center for Populism Studies organizes this panel series to discuss the state of political populism in different regions. These include a monthly series and additional panels organized in collaboration with various institutes on timely and critical topics. Our monthly panels included Mapping European Populism panel series on global populism. In this series, we have recently covered South Asian countries. As part of this series, we also organize additional panels with the institutes in the regions. Today, we have one of our unique panels, and it will discuss populism and electoral politics. Following the 8th panel, Mapping European Populism series, this panel series on global populism started in March 2023.
Zahra, could you please mute your mic?
Following the 8th panel, Mapping European Populism. Following the 8th panel, Mapping European Populism series, this panel series on global populism started in March 2023 by discussing populism and the far right in Australia. The latest and 6th panel discussion, varieties of populism and authoritarianism in Malaysia and Singapore. The reports and videos of each panel are published on our website and YouTube channel. These panel reports and recordings are invaluable sources for scholars, policymakers, the broader audience, and anyone concerned by the current challenges to democracy in the world posed by populist politics. Please check our YouTube channel and panel series and other ECPS programs if you are interested. Today, our panel will examine populism and electoral politics around the world. We are very grateful for all scholars and experts sharing their years of work and wisdom with our panel series. That being said, let me introduce our moderator and panelists today. Our moderator, Dr. Fizza Batool, is an assistant professor at Zahid Zulfikar Ali Bhutto Institute of Science and Technology in Karachi. She is also a member of ECPS Early Careers Research Network and co-organizer of this panel with a host institute. Dr. Fizza Batool worked in the research and development sector for over a decade, serving in important managerial positions. Her works have been published in prestigious journals like South Asia, Journal of South Asian Studies, Pakistan Horizon, etc. She is currently authoring a book on populism in Pakistan, scheduled to be published in 2024 by Palgrave Macmillan. She also contributes to English dailies in Pakistan and international research magazines such as South Asian Voices. Continuing, our first speaker is Dr. Andrej Zaslove and will talk on the radical right and radical left in Anno 2023. What does populism got to do with it? Dr. Zaslove is an associate professor at Radboud University in the Netherlands. His research examines populism and political parties, focusing on measuring populism, citizens' attitudes, populism and democracy, populism in foreign policy, populism and gender, and the influence of populism on party systems. Continuing, Dr. Bert and Bakker will be our second speaker. And the title of his speech is Psychological Roots of Populist Voting. Dr. Bakker is an associate professor at the Amsterdam School of Communication Research at the University of Amsterdam. His work focuses on contemporary issues, social polarization, and populism, studying the psychological roots of citizens' political beliefs and the role of personality and emotions in shaping political views. He co-founded the Hot Politics Lab, a lab group studying the role of emotions and personality in politics, and founded and co-organized the Dutch Political Psychology meetings. Dr. Bakker published at the Nature Human Behavior, the Journal of Communication, the American Political Science Review, and the Journal of Politics. He serves as an associate editor at the Journal of Experimental Political Science. Our third panelist, Dr. Jennifer Sheehy-Skeffington, will talk on the psychological appeal of populism. Dr. Sheehy-Skeffington is an associate professor of social psychology at the Department of Psychological and Behavioral Science at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She is a social psychologist interested in the mechanisms underlying human sensitivity to power, status, and group membership in the social context. She has affiliations with New York University Abu Dhabi, the University of Oslo, and Aarhus University. Dr. Sheehy-Skeffington teaches social and political psychology, communications, and broader classes at the intersection of these three fields, and is an ardent supporter of topics like equality, employability, and access to resources. She is a leading researcher and teacher in her field, invited as a keynote speaker to many programs and conferences. This takes us to our fourth speaker, Dr. Farhan Hanif Siddiqui, and his talk on electoral populism in Pakistan and India. Dr. Siddiqui is an associate professor at Quaid-e-Azam University in Islamabad. His research interests include ethnic politics and movements, conflict analysis and resolution, federalism, societal security, and democratic consolidation. He recently co-authored a book titled Introducing International Relations, published by Oxford University Press, and wrote extensively on politics of ethnicity in Pakistan, civil-military relations, conflict resolution and security, foreign policy, political culture, and global foreign relations in Asia and around the Indian and Pacific Oceans. His previous research included minorities in Kurdistan, in the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Our last speaker, Dr. Salim Cevik, who will talk on populist strategies of Erdogan in the 2022 elections. Dr. Cevik has published extensively on elections in Turkey and is an associate at the Center for Applied Turkey Studies in Germany. His research interests include state and religion, Islamist movements, political Islam, domestic politics, populism, nationalism, and Turkey in the Middle East. He conducted research at Columbia University and Lund University, taught at Istanbul, Bigli University, IPEC University, and worked as a postdoctoral fellow at Lund University Center for Middle Eastern Studies in Sweden. As a reminder, the Q&A session will follow the completion of the presentation of the panelists. You can write your questions in the chat box or raise your virtual hand to pose your questions in person. Now it is an honor for me to leave the floor to Dr. Fizza Batool to continue. Thank you.
Thank you, Jahan. So without ado, first, thank you all the speakers for accepting our invitation to join this panel. And without further delay, I'm just asking Dr. Andrej Zaslove to start his presentation. And I'm looking forward to. And a little change because Dr. Zaslove has to attend another meeting. So after his presentation, we'll have a small, brief question answer session, and then we'll move to the.
I'll be able to stay. I just have to leave around 12. I'll stay. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, good. Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm going to present. So I was asked to present the electoral fortunes of populist parties in Europe. I mean, that's my focus, and to think a little bit about my research on measuring populism. So I've tried to sort of figure a way of combining the two. So let me know what you think. I have some sort of figures and stuff like that. So I never know how this stuff comes across over the internet. Anyway, or over Zoom. So let me just begin. So my plan is, as I just said, I'll begin by just very briefly, nothing too comprehensive, thinking about the electoral success of populist parties, and then thinking a little bit about about measuring populism. And then at the end, I sort of wanted to think about maybe some avenues for consideration and future research, thinking about what role does populism play, and maybe even thinking whether populism is still important, or the degree that it remains important when we're thinking about these kinds of political actors. Sorry, my screens. I'm looking at my screen. I hope it's not too annoying. Just very briefly, I just thought, and this is not meant to be comprehensive, and I'll explain why in a second. I just have some little figures here, and I kind of want to make a point here. Hopefully you can see that if we look at sort of vote share, and I've chosen here what I would consider three of the more long-term populist parties. So I've chosen the Austrian Freedom Party, the French National Front, and the Lega Nord in Italy. And I don't know if this comes across, but what my point is I want to make is that that populism is not new, radical right populism. And sometimes I think some scientists know this, but I often get called by journalists, and we act like this is something that's come across in the last 10 years or 20 years, but it's something that's been around for a while. And I don't think to us this is anything too new, but we can see that, if we look at the beginnings of populism, I think of populism beginning in the 1990s and the 2000s, and some parties such as the Lega Nord, the Green Line, obviously was a more minor player until more recently, but this has to do with the party system in Italy and some of the regional aspects of the Lega Nord's populism, and the degree to now it's become more of a mainstream party. At the same time, we also know that there's been rises of newer populist parties, and we can, it's kind of a ridiculous graph maybe, but we can sort of try to point out that some of the populist parties have begun much sooner, and their electoral success is much more limited. And lastly, we can also focus on left-wing populist parties. So here, sort of thinking that populism was originally in Western Europe, and in particular something that was seen as more right-wing, but more recently it's become something that's also more left-wing as well. So I don't know if that came across in any way, but I guess my point here is the following, and let me just go forward. Sorry, I'm trying to do a couple of things. Is that populist parties have been around for a while, and we know that populist parties, are parties of government now. This is not extensive, but we know the parties in Italy have been in government. If I name two, the Lega Nord of the Lega, the Brothers of Italy, the Austrian Freedom Party, and then we have our two cases from Central and Eastern Europe. So my point here is I think the old populist parties are nothing new, and I would say that they've become now permanent or pretty stable features of electoral politics, with their ups and down cycles. And sometimes I think we overestimate the degree to which populist parties behave different than other parties. I think we can think about incumbency and other issues that play a role similar to other parties with populist parties. We can think of newer populist parties. So I think that one thing that's happened, if we're talking about the growth of populist parties, I think that we see the spread in many more countries. I mean, most countries now have some form of, in Western Europe or Eastern Europe as well, have some form of a populist party. And populist parties, I think, have spread across the spectrum from the left and the right. So I think what I've said here is nothing new or nothing really earth-shattering. But I guess the point I want to make is maybe the following. This list is not comprehensive by any means. And my question is or rhetorical question is, well, is such a list possible? And how do we even think of such a list, or how do we make such a list? And I think in order to make such a list, we have to think about, how are we going to decide what we're going to include and what we're going to disclude or not include. So I think this is sort of a way to make a transition to some of the other work that I've done on measuring populism with my colleagues. And one way we measured is on supply side, and one way we measured is on demand side. And so I'll begin here with some thoughts on supply side. So obviously, when we begin with supply side measuring, we have to first think about okay, how are we going to define this? And I use the thin-centered ideology approach, which I won't go into. And second of all, we have to sort of think about what are we going to focus on. So in terms of our focus on for our data, how are we going to think about measuring this? And I think there's several ways we can do this: manifestos, media. But I think that one of the more recent developments is thinking about expert surveys. And this is what I'll focus on to sort of highlight some of the work I've done with Maurits Meyers and more recently with Robert Huber. There's other nice data sets. One is from the Populist. The Populist is a new nice data set that's just been published. But they take a little bit of a different approach. They take more of a dichotomous approach, and we take more of a continuous approach. And I'll sort of talk about what this means and what I think the advantages are. So as I said, I'll focus on our Populist data, and we have a new version coming out in 2000, just in the next couple of months, which has been in the field, and we're just putting the data set together. So I think there's some advantages to thinking about expert surveys and some disadvantages. I think one of the advantages is that experts, when they're thinking about their expert judgments, hopefully they're taking a broader aspects into play, not just looking at programs, thinking about campaigns and thinking about larger issues. One of the things that I like about expert surveys is that I think we can get a score on a large number of parties. So I think that this really gets a more comprehensive measure of not only parties that are populist, but also parties that are, we maybe consider not populist or less populist, and the extent to which we get a score on a broad range of parties. I think maybe one of the disadvantages, and this is an open question that I'm sort of considering, is the extent to which expert surveys are sensitive to change and over time. But that's maybe an open question. So does this fulfill the criteria of how I started, of how we choose parties? Not necessarily. I mean, I think that even if we think about measuring it in a continuous manner as we do in POPA, and thinking about the party system in general, I think we eventually do have to sort of think about cutoff points if we're going to sort of choosing who are the populists. So I'm not saying this completely solves the problem, but I think looking at it this way maybe gives us some new insights. And so I'll just look at a couple of countries to show what I mean. So what I have here is on the y-axis I have our populist measure, and this is using five different items. I think it's 5 different items. I mix it up between our demand side. 5 different items here, and this gives us a measure of populism based on the thin-centered ideology approach. And then we have, I just placed it here on the x-axis on the left and right divide. So what we see immediately is the usual suspects up on the right-hand corner. So the right, we see our Freedom Party, our Forum for Democracy, and some of our other radical right parties, which we would consider to be highly populist. But if we go to the left-hand side, we have a party such as the SP, which is the Dutch Socialist Party, which we consider maybe a borderline case. And I think this is something that our continuous measure maybe addresses. So would I consider the Socialist Party a populist party? I'm not sure. I would say that it's more populist than some of the other mainstream parties, and it's less populist than some of the other radical right parties. So I think this is something, again, thinking about measuring populism and thinking about including or excluding. I think it's a continuous measure. And I wouldn't say that someone is populist or not populist. I would say that someone is more or less populist. So here I have a measure in Germany, and we have less parties. But I see that we see a similar thing. So we have the alternative for Germany on the right-hand side, and then we have Die Linke on the left-hand side. And according to our experts, the Die Linke scores, I don't know, something around a 7. Again, if you would ask me, is Die Linke populist? Should I include them if I'm thinking about electoral success? Well, I would say maybe. depending on a more or less criteria. My last one I'll show is Italy, and I think we see similar things. We see the three cases: the 5-star, the Lega, and Meloni's party. But then we see Forza Italia, which is also the FI is considered a populist party. Interestingly, in this survey, they seem to score less, lower populist, which actually I think fits with the development of the party. Again, though, a border case. So we see that some parties are clearly populist. We see some are borderline cases, and we see that other parties are less populist. Again, does it completely solve the problem of who to include or who doesn't, not to include? I would say maybe not, but I would say this is one of the things about populism. I see populism as something, a degree of parties are more or less populist, which doesn't mean they eventually don't have to create cutoffs if we're going to use it in regressions or other kinds of things. But I think that this allows us to then think about how we're going to generate the cutoffs. I see I'm running a little bit out of time, so I'm going to very quickly say that I think that we can say similar things about demand side, and there's numbers of scales that look at demand side, and I use our own scale, the Ackermann scale, but there's other excellent scales out there as well, where they all have disadvantages and advantages. So I have I see now I have sort of a strange figure here. This is kind of a bit of a lopsided, but this is our demand side measurement, populist attitudes. This is based on CFA regression scores. That's why the scale looks a little bit strange. Anyway, here we can see similar to the supply side, similar things that mainstream parties tend to score lower, and radical right populist parties tend to score higher, and we also see some links with left-wing populist parties. Again, sort of showing degrees of populism, which is what I want to show here. So what does this all mean? I think that again, I think this shows that populism on demand and supply side occurs in degrees. Populism occurs across different dimensions. So here I'm showing it over left-right dimensions, but of course I could do it over other dimensions. I think populist parties can partly explain the identity of populist parties. And I think populist attitudes can partly identify identity. But someone's mic is on. Yeah, populist attitudes voting for populist parties. Just so you know, I'm not going to go on too long. I just have a couple more slides to think more generally about some thoughts that we could think about. I think that we have to be careful, though. I think that populism is something very specific, and I've been talking about populism. And I think that one thing about populism that it does do is well, populism is something very specific. I think that we shouldn't broaden the term to too many actors. And I think that populism does unite very different parties in the terms of the left and right axis or different dimensions. And it does unite very different supporters for different parties as well. But at the same time, I think we have to be careful, because I think if we're thinking about populism, we have to think about the mechanism of populism. And what does populism actually do if we're talking about populism? So I'm thinking that, so in one way, if we're thinking about political parties, I think that what populism does, it might actually say something about the way that populist actors interact with political institutions. And let me give you one example from Italy. If I think about Meloni, then I think about Salvini. Even though our expert survey scored Meloni quite high, I actually think that Meloni now is not very populist. And I think that we can see this in the way that she interacts with the institutions. I don't see such an insider-outsider relationship with the institutions, and she's much more willing to engage with the institutions than a Salvini, who I see as much more populist. So just trying to highlight here maybe some of how, if we're thinking about populism and the way that populism does something or doesn't do something, I'm thinking about actors and the way they interact with institutions. At the demand side, I'll keep it short here, but I think that perhaps the populism says or helps us to understand maybe the way that individuals at the individual level think about political representation, and the way they think about how citizens should be represented. But I think that that we have to be careful about populism, because populism is not something that once you're a populist, you're always a populist. As I said, I think that the parties can change; they can become more or less populist. There's some nice research here that's come out. And sorry, I'm missing a citation here. A nice research from Robert Huber and his colleagues who show that populists can become more or less populist depending on whether their party is in government or not. And some German colleagues here show that populist individuals can change over time, that people can become less or more populist. So I think, such as other attitudes, we have to be careful to think that we're not talking about this neither dichotomously and neither as something that is going to be stable or necessarily stable. Also, I think that we maybe have to be careful that when we're talking about populism, so there's a debate over the attaching ideology. And since I've been talking about populists here, this is not to say that the attaching ideology isn't important, and maybe it's even more important. So that's why I'm saying we have to think about what does populism do, and maybe the attaching ideology is even more important. And this may be even so that populism might not even be important in the future. So by thinking about Meloni now becoming part of the institutional structure, I'm not so sure that we can even say that she's continuing to be populist. And here, Bert, also from the Netherlands, maybe has some comments here. And this is sort of a dangerous what I'm going to say, maybe. But I'm even wondering the degree to which Wilders is still as populist as he always was. I think his attaching ideology, if I watch the current elections, I think the attaching ideology is much more important for him than his populism. Anyway, so that's my last slide. And so thinking about, I think we could think about similar developments at the individual level. Anyway, I'll leave it there, and I will stop sharing my slides and stop my presentation there.
So there are time differences, Dr. Zaslove. I'm not sure. Do you want me to go to the question answer session, or are you staying till then?
I'll stay until 12 o'clock.
Great.
So whatever you like, it doesn't really matter.
Yeah. Okay, that's great. So I will now invite Dr. Bert and Bakker, who will present, who'll talk about the psychological roots of populist voting. So moving to the demand side of populism. Dr. Bakker. You're mute. We can't hear you.
Sorry, I need to set up my slides. 1 second. And then share my screen. Yeah, thanks a lot for the invitation. It's great to be here. I think this is although we all might have a little bit of a Zoom trauma of the pandemic, I think this type of event actually shows some of the good things the pandemic might have taught us, that we can actually interact what might be actually on a truly global scale with each other, talking about a topic that is of interest to many people across the world. And so I'm grateful for the invitation, and was Andrej was always it's always a pleasure to listen to my colleague Andrej, who's close by, a couple 100 kilometers, 150 kilometers from me. So that's really close. On yes, some of other people are a bit further away from us, Andrej. And just to pick up on your last comment, we're about to go into elections in the Netherlands, and it is indeed I think it's interesting to see that what might have been traditional populists like Geert Wilders and the Freedom Party, who's, don't forget, right? I don't know if anybody thinks the Netherlands is a country to pay attention to, but Geert Wilders is one of the longest sitting members of parliament. By now, I think if he gets elected, which he will be the longest sitting member. Has always been considered a true populist, but in a strange turn of events is now maybe, indeed much more campaigning along ideological lines on a pretty traditional conservative, on the cultural issues, conservative policy agenda to make himself salonfähig to maybe join a coalition. And I'm not a fortune teller, maybe Andrej is, but it could indeed happen for him this time around. Let's see. The one thing about the Netherlands is that usually the coalition you expect is not the coalition you get. But it is indeed shows that populism can be varying. I'm going to talk about something very different. I'm going to talk about the psychological roots of populism. And this is work that I've been doing in the past years with my colleagues Matthijs Roduin and Gijs Schumacher, both at the University of Amsterdam. And we do, it's been inspiring a lot of the work we do in our lab, the Hot Politics Lab. It will be sort of a selection of things that we've done in the past, and I could maybe also look ahead a little bit on what we will be doing. I also think it's always good to talk a little bit about the sort of intellectual history of how projects come about. And this project started in this fancy hotel lobby of the Midwest Political Science Association. Those of you who've been to the Midwest, it's this old, very rundown hotel. It looks it's much less fancy than the picture looks, actually. It's very run down by now, which is true for some people and that have maybe been there. And we were sitting here at one of these tables and talking a bit. I was still a PhD student, and Matthijs was working on populism, and I was working on psychological disposition. And Gijs was sort of the middleman, bringing us together, and said, like, should we not see if there's something to what sets populist voters apart from other voters when it comes to their psychological disposition? So we're like, yeah, that's a great idea. Sunday afternoon after 4 days of conferencing, so we set out with the idea to write a paper, which I think, of all the ideas I've developed in this building, for instance, also, this is one of the better ideas that also materialized, which is always nice. What we in particular thought is well, what is populism? We then have to think a little bit about, and I will not redo what Andrej has already been doing, but following sort of a lot of at least Western European-based scholars would say is that populism is an anti-establishment, so the elites are corrupt, evil, self-centered, and these the corrupt, evil elites don't take care of the common good people in a particular country. That could be the Dutch people, the German people, doesn't matter where you are in the world. And this populism can be combined with all sorts of ideological positions, right? So we often talk about the right wing populists such as Geert Wilders, but there are also more left-wing progressive or at least left-wing economically populist parties such as Podemos in Spain or Die Linke in Germany, and there might also be populists who are relatively centrist or not a lot of ideology, such as the Five-Star Movement, or at least difficult to capture. So what we said, well, we're focusing really on this populist core, so anti-establishment and people-centrism. And what we did in a first series of what we did in a series of papers is to see what could indeed set apart the populist voters compared to non-populist voters when it comes to their psychological dispositions. Well, at the time, I was working a lot on these so-called Big Five personality traits: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And where openness and conscientiousness have been pretty consistently correlated with ideology. So the more close-minded and conscientious are across the world, well, not totally robust across the world, but most of the Western world at least correlates positively with conservative policy positions, especially on the cultural domain. So we thought, well, these traits don't really set apart populists, right? Because populism is not this ideology, it's this people-centrism, anti-establishment. And so another trait that is within this Big Five framework is the trait agreeableness, which captures it's an individual difference that captures variation, the extent to which people are caring, tender-minded, trusting. That's on the high end of agreeableness, but the low end of agreeableness, people are distrusting, cynical, tough-minded. And here, inspired by some of the work in psychology, we thought, well, could it be that this anti-establishment, this populist rhetoric matches with the psychological disposition of the low agreeable? So the elites are evil, corrupt, self-centered, don't take care of the common good people. Does that resonate better with people who dispositionally are distrusting, cynical, tough-minded, the low agreeable? So in the first study we did, that was published by now quite a long time ago in the European Journal of Political Research. We took data on the left-hand side to see the United States. So that was support for the Tea Party, a populist movement within the Republican Party. We had two samples for support for the Tea Party. In the middle, you see the Freedom Party in the Netherlands. That's the PVV. And on the right-hand side, you see Die Linke, a left-wing populist party in Germany. And what you see are predicted probabilities over the range of from low to high agreeableness. And what we consistently found is that the lower agreeable were more likely to vote for populist parties in these three countries. This is correlational evidence, and there's no evidence of the mechanism or the argument that we actually propose that it's because of this anti-establishment, people-centrism rhetoric. In defense of this paper, we do have different populist parties, factions. So the Link is definitely a different party than the Freedom Party, but it's a selection of evidence. And so a few years later, we decided, can we do this better? Can we do it more elaborate? Can we also test it in a little better way? And that's what we did in a paper that came out in the Journal of Politics 2 years ago, the Populist Appeal. So the first thing we did is let's try to get as many samples where we needed two things. We needed countries where there were populists, and we needed samples that contain measures of agreeableness. And well, this is the selection of countries where we found data, which ranges from the United Kingdom, where we had the UK Independence Party, an anti-EU populist movement, Germany, where we had both Die Linke, but also the AfD that came up at that time, which is a right-wing populist party. In Denmark, we have the Danish People's Party, right-wing. The Netherlands, it is the Freedom Party. In Switzerland, it's the Swiss People's Party, which have been in government quite consistently. In Spain, it's Podemos. In Venezuela, it's Hugo Chavez. In the United States, it's Donald Trump. I just have to see what the other, and that were the countries. So some parts, majority right-wing populists, but there are also some left-wing, namely in Germany, we still have Die Linke, in Spain, Podemos, and in Venezuela, Hugo Chavez, with a left-wing host ideology. And what you see here are odds ratios of agreeableness scored from low to high, and an odds below 1 means that it's the lower agreeable are more likely to vote for a populist party. And what you see here is that across all these different samples, which have different sampling schemes, different measures of agreeableness, all the odds are in the expected direction, so they're below 1. The confidence intervals sometimes overlap with 1, which means they're not statistically significant. But if you look at the bottom panel, which is the pooled analysis, see that over all these samples, there is indeed a modest effect of a small to modest effect of low agreeableness on voting for these populist parties. This is still not evidence for the argument that it's because of these anti-establishment rhetoric, but it is evidence that over a wide range of countries and over a wide range of different populist parties, we do see this consistent pattern. So what do we do next? The next thing is we designed a conjoint experiment. So conjoint experiment is basically a fancy blown up vignette experiment. So we ask people repeatedly to choose between two fictional candidates, candidate A and B. And these candidates had a set of characteristics. So they had a host ideology, they were right-wing or left-wing on cultural and economic issues. They had certain backgrounds, they were experienced politicians or not, but they also varied their, we've also varied their anti-establishment, and this was done in the United States. Why the United States? Well, we had an opportunity to collect some data there. So the anti-establishment message was the people in Washington are corrupt and evil, and the pro-establishment was the people in Washington take good care. They work hard and are honest. We had a people-centrism message, so that the people are the politicians are not taking care of the common good American people, or they are taking care of them. And it was a message around conflict, just about like I will fight for you. And what you see here are the predicted probabilities of voting for a candidate with, on the left-hand panel, anti-establishment message versus a pro-establishment message, people-centrist or non-people-centrist, and conflict or non-conflict. And what you see here on the left-hand panel is that the lower agreeable, so the low end of the scale, they have a higher probability to vote for a anti-establishment candidate with an anti-establishment message compared to a pro-establishment message. Well, at the high agreeable level, there's no distinction. People-centrism does not that effect of that message is not moderated by agreeableness, nor is conflict we see that the high agreeable are shying away from conflict, which is actually makes sense. Like the agreeable consensus seeking, they don't like politicians who see conflict. But in defense of our argument, it is indeed the anti-establishment message that sets apart, that activates the low agreeable. It's these anti-establishment versus pro-establishment that lead to more votes among the low agreeable. There's also been a lot of talk about other psychological dispositions, and I'm not married to agreeableness at all. But what we also did, we had measures of authoritarianism, a disposition to prefer order, structure, and hierarchy. And what we see with authoritarianism, that doesn't moderate the effects of this anti-establishment or people-centrism messages. Authoritarianism moderates the effect of the ideology measures. So high authoritarian, like anti-immigration politicians, which you would expect. But so when it comes to the psychological roots, it is not the populism that sets apart the authoritarian. No, it's the ideology. So authoritarian people like right-wing ideology in most Western countries. So that's sort of the first sort of steps. I'm wrapping up a little bit. I'm making it myself a little bit more complicated. This is all assuming that personality is causing or is underlying or is activated by populist rhetoric. In some recent work I've done with Jiv Lelkes and Arya Malka, we in the personality ideology literature have made the claim, both with panel studies and experiments, that the reverse could also be true. So ideology could also activate personality. Well, it's a little bit too little time to go into that detail, but it could be that if you're, Andrej also hinted a little bit on this with the Freedom Party, it could be if you become a Freedom Party supporter that, you know, who you portray yourself as who you are might also be affected by that political identity. And this is not, there's growing work in political behavior that suggests that politics can also shape non-political identities. I just wanted to raise this, and I think I have 2 more minutes, so I'm just gonna wrap it up a little bit. So what we have shown is that low agreeableness is associated with support for populist parties across a wide range of different populist parties in different contexts. And the experiment shows that it's the anti-establishment rhetoric that really activates this. Authoritarianism and other traits like openness and consensuousness are really activated by the ideology. So if we want to understand populism, that's not the traits that you want to focus on, because that's what you want to do if you study ideology. So populists seem to speak the language of their voters with the degree of caution that, well, maybe the whole causality argument might be opposite. That is an ongoing discussion. that's the psychological dispositions part. I want to raise one. This has been the first part of my sort of career, and half in that career, I also started to study much more the role of affect. And there is obviously also the question: are populists striking the emotional chord? So in a paper led by Gijs Schumacher, where we did a whole bunch of lab in the field experiment. So we went to all sorts of events through the Netherlands, like evangelical gathering, a bikers fair, a bikers event, a fair, a museum. We showed people a populist or non-populist message. That for the rest, the only thing that varied was the degree of populism in it, while measuring their core physiological responses. So arousal with skin conductance and negative valence with the corrugator activity. So it's lab-based work. What we see is that people have a physiological responses that when political rhetoric is about politicians. So when we talk about politics, but the anti-establishment rhetoric does not lead to stronger physiological responses compared to pro-establishment rhetoric. So contrary to what we often talk about is that this populism activates the core affective experiences. We don't find evidence for that. We find some suggestive evidence that populist radical right voters, so people who in the pre-survey indicated they voted for the Freedom Party, and those with lower educational level are more triggered when exposed to a message that contradicts their worldview. So far-right voters listening to a pro-establishment message get a stronger activating physiological response. This is all really exploratory, and this is all we should be seeing as scratching the surface on these effective responses. And it's exploratory. So we need more research on the role of these physiological responses to anti-establishment and pro-establishment messages. This paper should thereby just not, it's not conclusive. None of the evidence is conclusive here, right? And I'm happy to lead where the science is leading us. But compare, like for the agreeableness, we have quite some evidence. This is just the first study with 400 participants in the Netherlands. What I want to end with is that I think that populism is a really interesting case if you're interested in trying to understand the psychology of voters. We talked about Geert Wilders. He's by now the longest sitting member of parliament, but he still portrays himself as an outsider. How can you credibly do that, right? Or we have Thierry Baudet, who's like as elitist can be. He drives a Jaguar, plays classical piano, but portrays himself as fighting against corrupt elites. So there's this really interesting psychological mindset. And the work on dispositions has been one, but that's just one area. There's a lot there that can be done. I think a common theme for sort of political psychologists who come from political science is don't confuse populism with the host ideology. I think that is important to distinguish by design, or at minimum by the implication. We need more research, sorry for the typo here, across context. Our Journal of Politics paper was an attempt, but there is less publicly available data in some context. And this is also an invitation if you're interested in working on topics related in other contexts. I'd definitely be interested to talk. And I think affect is really one part of the psychological processes that is crucial but not very well understood in the populism realm, especially if we move away what people can say. These were sort of my thoughts. I hope they were insightful to some extent. Feel free to reach out either in the discussion or afterwards.
Thank you, Dr. Bakker. And I am sure the examples you shared, the students, since they're mostly from Pakistan, they can relate it because we do have our own cases where the psychology of voting is a big question. And more on this psychological appeal of populism, Dr. Jennifer, I would love to hear your thoughts. So please.
Hello, can everyone hear me? Okay, I apologize. My headphones are not working today, so it might be a little bit echoey. you're hearing in the room. Anyway, it's really wonderful to be able to contribute to today's panel. Thank you, Fizza, for the invitation, and to everyone else for coming along. Psychologists don't study populism much. I think the political psychologists coming from psychology have mostly looked at it from the point of view of, classic political psychology predictors of voting for right and left-wing populist parties. Actually, sorry, mostly right-wing populist parties. This also isn't a core area of my research. One area of my research looks at the impact of socioeconomic conditions on decision-making. The other is looking at the roots of ideology, particularly the psychological roots of ideology. So Bert and I have a whole separate conversation we can have about that. I'm fascinated by his work. But I did, with my former PhD student, Sandra Obradovic, and collaborator Seamus Power, we did start thinking about populism just in terms of, were we satisfied that what we've learned from social psychology was adequately represented in the literature on populism, which was mostly coming from political science at the time. So, and that prompted us to do a review paper proposing some key kind of findings and lenses from social psychology with which to approach the question of populism. I'm going to present that today and then show you some early findings of some empirical work that we're now doing to try to examine qualitatively how we might see these coming out. And in particular, it's a really nice compliment to Bert's talk, because we are mostly focusing in this talk on populist rhetoric, so really thinking about the supply side. And so it's fascinating to see those findings about how it is being received by people too. Okay. Right, so I'll talk you through a little bit of the theoretical framework, mindful that there are fewer social psychologists maybe in the audience. And then, as I mentioned, some early findings from our current project. So the first thing that I think most political scientists would accept is the importance of groups and group identity in all of politics and political behavior. It's quite accepted now as a topic in political behavior, but especially when it comes to populism, right? Because populism is about essentially crafting a particular kind of intergroup relationship. We know that from Tashfeld and Turner, classic social identity theory perspectives about the basic human tendency to form identities, and the notion of us and them is key to what makes populist rhetoric work. In particular, as Casmude and others have discussed, there's specifically what makes something populist, and again, I'd adhere to the notion of populism as a thin-centered as opposed to a thick-centered ideology. What makes something populist is this differentiation and opposition of us, the people, and them, the ones who are trying to undermine the people. Right, usually them are the elites, but interestingly, as Brubaker has mentioned, and also has been explored by some aspects of social psychological research on populism, the nature of the them varies depending on whether right wing or left wing populism. So whereas you can think about this, Brubaker's thought about this in terms of vertical and horizontal axes and how this cuts across socioeconomic lines. Generally, the right wing has considered cultural or ethnic as markers of in-group versus out-group, and mostly thinking about that horizontal axis. So that's why it's more associated with nativism, for example, whereas left-wing populists have looked at the more vertical axis and looking at economic differences, and has been more socialist in its tendency, thinking about the working classes versus an establishment kind of middle upper class. What I meant by saying that I like the idea of populism as thin-centered is really to resonate with what Bert just said there, in terms of being aware that we shouldn't equate populism with a specific ideology. As Mude and Kaltwasser have said, it's more of a thin-centered frame through which to view politics, the notion of us and them, the pure people, the corrupt elite, and that onto which you can hang another ideology. So onto which you can hang nativism or socialism or various other more specific narratives for what's going on and what needs to be done. Another helpful perspective from social psychology is some newer research looking at leaders as identity entrepreneurs. I think this is helpful, especially to think about the appeal of Trump. And some of the examples Bert was mentioning in terms of this, how is it that a member of such a historic elite can present themselves as a member of the common people? In order to do that, you kind of need to be entrepreneurial in presenting yourself as the prototype of the identity category, the people. And so Steve Reicher, for example, has discussed the ways that Trump and others have done that in retelling a story of themselves that also retells the story of what the people is. So now the people becomes like political outsiders, for example, which Trump was once. And it's not really about socioeconomic outsiders, which he obviously isn't. And of course, populist leaders don't just emerge in times of crisis. The crisis doesn't happen, populism doesn't come as a response. What we can learn from psychology is the importance of construal, right? Not just of what's happening in people's lives or what's happening in a country, but of how that's construed. And therefore how the notion of crisis and the origins of crisis and the solutions of crisis can be constructed by populist leaders. So that's it for groups. Importantly, as a political psychologist coming from the tradition of social dominance theory, this is from Jim Sidenius, with whom I did my PhD research at Harvard, we cannot think of groups without thinking of hierarchy. So groups are not just arrayed along this kind of equal axis where you have in groups and out groups and each of them is equally prejudiced. Instead, when we're thinking about groups, we're always thinking about which groups have more power and resources, where does our group sit on the hierarchy? Which of course taps into our personal concern for how much I have in relation to others in an interpersonal hierarchy. And we know that status concerns are very relevant in terms of especially some more recent, let's say, anti-egalitarian backlashes. Some interesting work, for example, looking at the Brexit referendum by, I think, Jane Green, focused less on trying to understand focused on the importance of perceptions that your group, like let's say your region or your ethnic group, was doing worse than other ethnic groups. So the sense that like our group is doing worse than others and that's not legitimate. Relative deprivation is a key concept here. The notion that we're doing worse than we should be doing. And this, going back to that Green study, for example, I think provides an indicator for how we can move beyond what had been a typical sense of a dichotomy or a tension between economic versus cultural drivers of populism. So, is populist sentiment a result of economic conditions or of some kind of obtuse cultural factors? Instead, if you look at it as a social psychologist, you can see how those economic concerns, create a sense of dissatisfaction that needs to be understood somehow, construed through a narrative, and can be construed through a narrative that becomes cultural, that mobilizes the notion of identity, such that, and that's where it's not just that I'm doing poorly because of the decline of manufacturing in my town, it's that I understand my bad life conditions from the context of, let's say, a white British person who's not getting enough access to government resources as compared to immigrants, as narrated through a right-wing populist lens. And then thirdly, the notion of emotion. I mean, emotion is key, especially we focus on collective emotions. So we know that emotions matter, and the qualitative research that is out there does talk about various emotions. Populism is mostly focused on negative emotions. I think it's discussed in the media, mostly in terms of resentment or anger or threat or fear. But I think it's very important to understand the role of positive emotion as well, in generating collective hope, for example, or affirming a positive in-group identity, in understanding why is it that different populist leaders have had such wide appeal. It's not just based on anger or racism or prejudice or resentment or wanting to tear a system down. It's also the sense of we can bring back alive a sense of collective we that we can feel proud of, and we can get kind of excited and think anything is possible when looking toward the future. And it does seem that positive affect seems to be more common with populist discourse rather than non-populist discourse, but that is looking at a very small sample of populist discourse there. And of course, emotions are framed in this relational terms. That's why I discuss it in terms of collective emotion. So there is then a prosociality, what we would call prosociality, i.e. positive cooperative intent driven by some populist support, even if it's parochial, right? Even it's positive about our group and our community, even if the consequences might be negative for people who are not seen as being a member of that group. So to summarize our framework, we need to think about us and them. We need to think about how groups are located in a societal hierarchy. And then we need to think about emotions and the use of emotions in responding then to stories about what might be happening to groups in hierarchy. And so what we did, we used that framework that's published in an article in Current Opinion in Psychology. We've since been using that framework to try to just study populist rhetoric. The first thing that we did was to say, well, is it the case that we see these themes and these patterns more commonly in populist versus non-populist political leaders? And also, do we see them in, and how does that play out differently along the left versus the right? Because it's very important. If you see populism as a thin-centered ideology, to consider right-wing and left-wing manifestations, as our previous speakers have done. So here, sadly, it's a very kind of Western and narrow focus. We looked at UK and US elections. We looked at 2 years run up to the elections and systematically gathered as many speeches as we could. We have 163 of them. So these are from candidates, from all candidates in those elections for whom we had enough speeches available, who could then be classified as right-wing, left-wing, populist, or mainstream. And here is an indicator of where the speeches are coming from. So as you can see, there's also an overrepresentation of Trump, because of things like that, we then also end up in our analyses collapsing across the UK and the US, and that's what I'm going to do today. Okay, so what did we do with this data? First, we identified, going through all of these speeches and had a look at key rhetorical themes and tropes from the discourse itself, and then developed a coding frame iteratively based on the theoretical framework that I've already outlined, but also in a data-driven way in terms of the codes that we were seeing. So that kind of, through in vivo leads to a large coding frame through which all the data was fed into a quantitative content analysis. We can then use that to do, sample size constrained comparisons of the prevalence of key themes across right-wing, left-wing, populist, and mainstream parties. And now, additionally, what we're doing now is a qualitative rhetorical analysis. This is really taking advantage of the discursive tradition in social psychology led by Sandra on our team, to look at what are the specific strategies, themes, and tropes. How am I doing on time? 5 minutes? Yeah? Okay. I forgot to check the time I started at. All right. So 5 minutes is good or less?
It's good. It's good.
Okay. So first, an initial validation. Of course, we want to check that this coding scheme is adequately able to capture the key themes you would expect it to capture in political speeches on the left and right. And as you might expect, we find classic left-wing themes. Social justice is much more prominent in left-wing speeches, no difference populist versus non-populist. And please get used to these graphs, because I'll always have the left-wing parties on the left, the right-wing parties on the right, and then I'll be comparing populist and mainstream. Sorry, here's the legend for comparing populist and mainstream. The mainstream one is always going to be blue, and the populist one is always going to be green. When it comes to safety, a classic issue of the right, you see that that's more likely to be mentioned in right-wing speeches, and something like national pride, again, a classic theme of the right, is again more likely to be mentioned in right-wing speeches. And no clear themes emerging here. That difference on the right that you see on the rightmost graph is not significant between populist and mainstream parties. Now to focus on the difference between populist and mainstream parties. One key one was that when it comes to group psychology, so first thinking about groups, everybody was talking about groups. So all groups were talking about groups and talking about we and using collective terms. This is perhaps unsurprising given the nature of politics. But the ways it was done was differently for populists versus those in the mainstream. So populist political candidates were less likely to focus on unity between groups. As one might expect, in terms of the importance of the us versus them distinction for populists, whereas mainstream parties were more focused on unity. And so, of course, the question there that we can't see until we go into the deeper analysis is to figure out exactly how are these group labels constructed differently on the left and the right. In terms of status and hierarchy, actually the most prominent theme to come out here was this notion of a rigged system. So both politicians on both sides, but only the populist politicians, gave a lot of references to the system being rigged, there being kind of this corrupt elite controlling things, with the people needing to challenge that. Now, what about collective emotion? As had been suggested in earlier literature, we do find more use of emotion in general among populist and non-populist, among populists on the right and left versus mainstream right and left. And you find this both for positive and negative emotion, but particularly for negative. So if you look at negative here, you can see it's very clear that the populists are being more negative than those in the mainstream. When it comes to positive emotion, there's no difference in the left wing between populist and mainstream, but in the right wing, you can see that there's a particular greater use of positive emotion by populists versus mainstreamers, and there's a significant interaction there between populism and orientation. I thought I'd give you a flavor of this. So the rhetorical analysis, looking at the detailed data, is only in an early stage, but I just pulled out some quotes for you guys today. What we find the general theme is probably that collective emotion on the populist left is about being fed up with the present. So here's Bernie Sanders. We're tired of 500,000 Americans sleeping out on the street. We're tired of 45 million people struggling with student debt. Tired of being the only country on earth not to guarantee a family medical leave. And when you're tired, you've got to stand up. You've got to fight back, right? So tired of anger. Jeremy Corbyn says, if you're young, you have a familiar feeling, being trapped in a job that barely covers the rent. You feel anxious, your heart sinks when you see the prices of homes displayed. Then you're being held back. Whereas when you look at emotion on the right, it really is much more about positive emotion. On the left, the positive emotion was mostly focused on the leader. Actually, it wasn't collective. Whereas on the right, the positive emotion was very collective. So it's really about kind of feeling good about being us and being the people. So Trump says, we conquered the unknown. This is time to reignite American imagination, to search for the tallest summit and set our sights on the brightest star, to rekindle the bonds of love and loyalty and memory that link us together as citizens, neighbors, and patriots. Boris Johnson says, we're going to restore trust in our democracy. I have every confidence we will have cracked it. We're not going to wait because the British people have had enough of waiting. The time has come to act, to give strong leadership and change this country for the better. And where there is negative affect in the right-wing populists, it's really about begrudging the others who are getting in our way. And of course, you can see where that leads in terms of authoritarian manifestations of populism. If the others are getting in the way of the people, we need to get rid of the institutional checks and balances that are blocking us. But here's Johnson saying, I'm fed up with being told our country can't do something when I believe passionately that it can. Okay, last set of findings is thinking about time. So one thing that wasn't driven by our framework, but that definitely emerged from the data, was the importance of appeals to time and temporality. First off, populists are much more likely to appeal to the past. And this is especially among the right wing. And you'll see in a minute how that's done differently on the left versus the right. What is anyone appealing to the present? That's actually the left-wing mainstreamers. And is anyone appealing to the future? That's the right-wing mainstreamers. But just with a focus on what the populists are doing here, you can see on the populist left, the past is discussed mostly in terms of cautionary tales. For years across the city, women factory workers and their allies have been sounding the alarm about dangerous and squalid conditions. Everyone knew about these problems. Does it sound familiar? This is the problem we have today in America, says Bernie Sanders. Jeremy Corbyn says, in 1983, I stood in Parliament for the first time. I was condemning deeply damaging cuts in public services. And he says, this is what's happening now as well. So really, like, things have been bad. We don't want to go back to that era. Whereas when the populist right discuss the past, it's in much more positive light, and it's about the legitimacy of legacy that we should be proud of. So Johnson talks about more than 200 years ago, the fires of Coalbrookdale created the first industrial revolution. Here we are again. Trump says 250 years ago gave birth to a special place called America. It was a time home to an incredible people with a revolutionary idea that they could rule themselves. That is what our country has always been about. No nation can long thrive that loses faith in its values, history, and heroes. What has always led America to prevail and triumph over the great challenges of the past has been an unyielding and unashamed conviction in the mobility of our country and its unique purpose in history. We must never lose this conviction. So I hope you can see how once you dig a little bit deeper, we start with the overall framework, dig deeper to see the extent to which these codes are coming out differently, and then dig deeper to see exactly how are they coming out among the different leaders. So all politicians reference groups and collectives, but national unity is something that's particularly underplayed by populist leaders. Hierarchy concerns seem to manifest differently. Those on the left are more concerned with social justice, but on both sides, there's this notion of the system being rigged. Emotion is consistently more often mobilized in populist versus mainstream rhetoric, greater use of positive emotional and negative emotional. But in particular, on the populist left, collective emotions are mostly negative, and on the populist right, they're mostly positive, although they are, except when they're begrudging of doubters getting in their way. Okay, and it's, yeah. So in terms of temporality, lastly, groups and status concerns, seem to be mobilized with reference to time. This was an unexpected finding. Populists seem to use time differently to non-populists. The mainstream right are focused on the future, but the populists are focused on the past, and again, slightly differently. The left thinking about a cautionary tale, and the right thinking about a proud legacy. So it's hard to kind of go quickly through qualitative research, but I hope that you found that kind of richness and that flavor helpful to add to the discussions today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Jonathan. Frankly, I wanted to hear more because it was very interesting, but we're running short on time. So, Dr. Farhan, so we have somehow tried and answer questions related to why voters choose populist leader, but how populist leaders make voters choose them. This is the question that we're trying to address now. So Dr. Farhan, if you could, please.
Thank you, Fizza, and thank you, the Center for Populism Studies, for having me here today. It's a very interesting panel discussion. So what I'll do over the next 15 minutes is to speak about electoral populism in India and Pakistan, and refer to the populist trends and shades that one finds in the election manifestos of the BJP in India and the PTI and the TLP in Pakistan. That's my primary evidence that I'm bringing to light in order to address how we can see populism, so to speak, making its space in both these countries. But before I come to it, what I would like to do is begin by raising and answering the question of what makes populist politics unique. Some of the earlier speakers have also referred to it. And what is it about populism that separates it from the other or conventional or traditional political parties and leaders? And I begin by making reference to an interesting little debate in the Nations and Nationalism Journal in 2017-18 on populism and its intersectionality with nationalism. So there was this article by Strakakis and Declean, who argued that populism and nationalism are analytically distinct, that we cannot conflate the two. So populism divides society on a vertical axis between the elites and the people down below, while nationalism creates a horizontal differentiation between who come, or the people who come within the boundaries of the nation. So those who are included and those who are excluded. And based on this analytical distinction, Strakakis and Declean argued that the far-right parties that we have in Europe who are anti-immigration, who are anti-immigrant, if you will, they are nationalists, but they're not populist in that sense. And then Brubaker wrote another article critiquing this analytical distinctiveness by arguing that populism and nationalist discourses are tightly interwoven with each other, that populist parties are very likely to not only include an anti-elitist tirade and rant, but also invoking popular cultural and religious slogans to mobilize their constituents. Now, my point is that what this debate misses out in is a very crucial element of populist politics, and I think which differentiates it from other conventional politics and politicians, is to appeal and to play with the emotional sentimentalities and sensitivities of the people, which the earlier two speakers also referred to. And this is where they make electoral gains. And in doing so, the evidence that we find in India and Pakistan, that what these populists do best, and again, that is different from conventional politics and politicians, is that they successfully embed within their constituents and followers an attitude and behavior of hate and differentiation. And this is done by simple heuristics, where complexities of socio-political life are reduced, they're simplified to a very commonsensical understanding, where entrenched elites are targeted for their corruption, and not only for their corruption, but working against the national interests or the national security of the state. The liberals are attacked and hated for their cultural appropriation, again, not only of Western values, but also democracy and political institutions, which are all seen as West-centric and hence a problem. And of course, minorities, which are seen as a threat to the majority, and that is why majoritarianism is a very, very strong component of populism. So what I'm saying is that the power of the populace emanates primarily from this instrumentalization of hatred, the instrumentalization of differentiation through the use of a very less complex language, which makes it easier for the voters to understand what they're advocating. And this leads to another point, which is another provocative aspect of populist political parties, is that when they're invoking the demos or when they're invoking the ethnos with the purpose of bringing them into politics, one part of the literature on populism sees this as one of the positive traits of populism because they contribute to an increase in voting percentages by bringing in the disenfranchised or the dispossessed or people who are depoliticized into the political mainstream. But I think what they do most crucially is they contribute to the empowerment of the individual voter. And that's where their strength lies. And that's, again, where electoral gains are made. So populist leaders, political parties provide for populist sovereignty in the truest sense and for popular participation in the truest sense, according to their interpretation, by vocalizing each and every single voter, a phenomena which is aided further by the digitalization and mediatization of politics through the social media. And I think as the individual voter assumes this sovereign role with the aid of a simple language and a simple common sense, where they see themselves as morally righteous compared to the elites who are all corrupt, and with the social media at their disposal, the vocabulary, the language, the ideas about entrenched elites, about liberal sections of society, about minorities, they assume a simple binary. And I think this binary is extremely dangerous and destabilizing for the impact, for the negative impact that it has on social cohesion, diversity, acceptance, and peaceful coexistence. So again, the power of the populist is ingrained in how they channel ontological elements such as anger and anxiety and hate and fear and betrayal, and how they structure these subjective experiences and use the political subjectivity of the voters to their own advantage. And that is where the high energy politics of populist parties and leaders is manifest, because they unleash their own politics, but they unleash this entire body of their mass supporters against their political opponents by providing them these simple cognitive tools to denigrate others. And of course, they're very, very pragmatic in the sense that they're able to understand that the continuation of this high energy antagonistic politics is, of course, self-serving to their electoral gain. So if you're speaking about India and Pakistan, I think one of the elements, and before I come to electoral politics, one of the elements which aids this rise in populist politics is a general institutional weakness of political parties. And I think that contributes to populist politics. And this institutional weakness of the political parties, these are very personalist form of politics. So in the sense that political parties have been able to make headway into the larger population within both these countries, there's still much to do in the sense of what these political parties have done for the last, since independence. And the other thing, another factor which aids the rise of the populist parties and political leaders is their emphasis on gross inequality. And inequality is the factor where large political sectors, population sectors, if you will, feel excluded from politics. And this is where these populist parties and politicians bring them into the mainstream with their own simplified language and discourses against political opponents. So coming on to the second bit about electoral populism in India, it's really interesting. If you read the election manifesto, and this is the 2019 election manifesto for the BJP, and it's contradictory, it's puzzling, it is confusing, because it combines the populism that we find within the manifesto is actually a developmental populism, which combines class, which combines caste, which makes references to the middle class. And what it does is that it argues that we are satisfying primarily the urge of this middle class, or what is termed as the new middle class. Modi terms it as the new middle class. So we are satisfying the urge of this middle class and new middle class, which is an urge for a very consumerist-oriented neoliberal capitalism. And this is something which the BJP, compared to the Congress party, has embraced not so to speak, contested against. So the BJP, in similarity to the Congress party, embraces this liberal free market economy, and that, so to speak, sustains its populist politics. The fact that in a few years' time, we will be the third largest economy in the world, that in 2047, we want to be the biggest economy in the world. All of this references to a new liberal market economy satisfies the urges of this middle class and this new middle class, which is now emerging in India. And it is precisely this middle class and new middle class which is favorable to the populism which is rising in both India and Pakistan. So in Pakistan, we have a very interesting, some political scientists, Mohammad Wasim, Akbar Zaidi, others, they have what is called as the middle class conservative thesis, the conservative middle class thesis, which basically argues that the middle class in Pakistan does not have a preference for democracy. They do not have a preference for human rights. They do not have a preference for participatory ethos. What the middle class basically wants is that it is very self-serving. It is very opportunistic. What it wants is economic stability. What it wants is economic progress. What it wants is job creation. And if that is satisfied, and if it is catered to, let's say, even in the Pakistani case, by a military government, and we have large phases of military dictatorship in our country, the middle classes will be satisfied. So the middle classes in India and the middle classes in Pakistan, so to speak, are influenced by this trajectory of a developmental populism that the BJP has engendered, and which makes notions of democracy and participation in human rights maybe less relevant to them. Again, it's very interesting that the electoral manifesto of the BJP speaks about the welfare of the poor. And I think the other thing which the populist politicians do well is that they bridge the right-left divide by appealing to the downtrodden sections of the society. So the simple configuration for them would be, in terms of their discourse, would be that they'll simply say that we're not only anti-elitist, but we're also pro-poor. And that appeals to a larger section of the society. So again, with reference to the BJP election manifesto, there's a lot of emphasis on including minorities, scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, the OBCs. All of them will be included in our developmental agenda of a new India. That's the primary slogan. So this new India will be an India where all of these different caste and class groups will come together. And that will, so to speak, lay the basis of a very uniform, seamless, homogeneous India. The only exclusivist orientation that you find within this manifesto, and there's only 2 or 3 lines on it, lies with respect to the Muslims. So the BJP says that in the election manifesto that we want to modernize the Muslim personal laws as they relate to divorce and marriage, and in that sense it targets the Muslim community, and it does so again in the name of modernity and social progress. So it's really interesting of how the developmental populism is combined with this idea of making India great, of India making the world's largest economy. And that, so to speak, sustains, I think, the populism within the Indian context. And then again, you have these immense followers of the BJP who are all vocalized and who infuse these themes with Hindutva, with a religious ideology, with a religious nationalism, which polarizes society and again, creates divides and divisions within society. Coming on to Pakistan very quickly, there are shades of developmental populism when we speak of Imran Khan's election manifesto 2018. But then again, the rising trend in Pakistan is of a religious populism. So we have these blasphemy laws in the country, which were instituted by the military dictatorship of General Zia-ul-Haq in the 1980s, which are basically about catering to the sanctity and the finality of the last prophet. And what this blasphemy discourse and what this blasphemy laws do is that they target the Ahmadi community within the country, and they are the ones who bear the brunt of this religious nationalism and populism that inflates the country. So if we go to the, and the result, in the 2018 elections were really interesting because the blasphemy discourse was at its very high. So one party which made a surprising electoral gains in these elections was a new party which started off as a social movement, became a political party, the Tehreek-e-Labbaik Pakistan, and I'll come to it a little later very quickly, which in the elections became received the fifth largest votes in the country when it comes to the votes received, and was able to win only 2 seats because of the FPTP system, only 2 seats in the Sindh Provincial Assembly. So if we go down very quickly to the PTI election manifesto, Imran Khan's political party, there are shades of similarity with the BJP. So if the BJP manifesto is about a new Pakistan, a new India, the PTI's electoral manifesto is for a new Pakistan. Larry Diamond makes the case that Populist also learned from each other, and there's a lot of learning there as well. So the BJP, it stated that we will create 20 million jobs. The PTI made the similar claim that we'll create 10 million jobs in the country, and of course establish 5 million new homes in the process. Again, a very pro-poor strategy, electoral strategy, political strategy that they instituted. And that is all embedded within this idea of a Riyasat-e-Madina, which is this proto-state that was created by the last prophet. And that is the ideal which the PTI approximates as what we need to reach. And they argue that this was the first welfare state in the history of mankind. And that's the simplicity of it, meaning who would want to reject it on a popular plane? And that is where the acceptance basically flows from. Dynasticism, elites, they're all criticized. And the same goes for the BJP. They're very critical of the Congress and other parties. And that is where they make gains. Coming to the TLP, the other party, which won these huge chunk of votes in the elections, its election manifesto is very explicit. It is very absolute. There's only a 1-point agenda, which is to preserve and protect the sanctity of the prophet. And it is very clear in its claim that all of the provincial, linguistic, geographic, racial, cultural divides that exist in the country are injurious to Pakistan. They have to be done away with. And people all across the country should identify themselves as Muslims only and not by any other criterion. So that's the message, that's the manifesto that comes through them. Now, the bad bit is, and this is where I'll end, the bad bit about all of this in the case of Pakistan is that this blasphemy discourse, that these blasphemy laws are not only the preserve of the PTI and the TLP, but they're also now being embraced very openly by the other mainstream parties, whether it is the PPP, whether it is the PMLN, whether it is the PMLQ. Just 2 quick examples. So the last government, the PDM government, which was a government of the People's Party and the PMLN, it amended the blasphemy laws to extend the punishment for blasphemy from 3 to 10 years. And their argument was that this creates an effective deterrent in society. So people wouldn't want to engage in blasphemy because now we have raised, the imprisonment sentence. And last year, the provincial government, one of the provincial governments of the largest province, they passed a new law which has made it mandatory for the husband and wife in a Muslim country, surprisingly, paradoxically, to declare themselves as believers in the finality of the prophet at the time of marriage. And that's really, really interesting and really, really controversial. So this is what I have to say. I hope I've made sense. And I look forward to your question and comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Farhan. Somehow I cannot...
Fizza, can I just say something? Because I have to leave at 12. So I don't want to dominate things, but maybe I saw a couple of questions for me. Could I just answer the questions? And I had a couple of questions for Jennifer, for the other participants, or if you'd rather just keep going, then that's also fine. I just didn't want to be rude. Just to make sure I'm just not leaving to go have lunch. I'm organizing a debate for the elections, and that's why I have to go. So, yeah.
So I think the last speaker is left. Just Dr. Salim is there, and then we can move to the question answer.
That's fine. That's perfectly fine. I just wanted to mention it.
Andrej, so that you'll have more time.
No, I didn't. No, but go ahead. Go ahead. Do your presentation, and then that's fine. No. I just didn't want to leave without without responding. Yeah, go.
So Dr. Salim, and again, a request, please try and cover that within 15 minutes time bracket.
I will, thank you. And thank you for the invitation. This was one of the best panels that I have participated in a long time. So a special thank you for the other participants, which kept a very high bar to me to not remain short of them, but I will do my best, and I will not also exceed my time. I was asked to talk about Erdogan's election strategies as a populist leader and how he won in 2023 elections. And this was, I guess, partly triggered by the expectation that he would lose. Many people would expect that this time he would lose. He has been in power since 2002, and the country was going through a big governance crisis, a big economic crisis. It couldn't respond to a devastating earthquake at all. So the expectation was that after all these failures and 20 years in government, you would assume that he would lose. And but he didn't. So how did it happen? I will have three things to say roughly. I will first talk about his strategies, and then I will also talk a little bit about the once an oxymoron concept of a guy ruling for 20 years and still labeled as populism. There was a time when the literature in populism first started. This would be considered an oxymoron by itself. The expectation was that populism is essentially an oppositional ideology, and once you came into power, just as, for instance, the Meloni case that Andrej mentioned in earlier, you start to work with institutions because you are now in power, so you can't be a populist ruler forever, right? It's contradictory, but in Erdogan's case, it's not. So I will talk a little bit about that, and then how the opposition failed to counter his tactics. So these are the three lines that I will talk about. Now, for his tactics, I think there is, and of course, an inherent ambiguity to the concept of populism. There is a more colloquial usage of the term, which often refers to more or less irrational policies that appeals to the feelings of the electorate rather than their material well-being, or their short-term interests. This is a more colloquial usage, and it is often refers, for instance, economic policies that might, in the short term, appear well to the electorate, but devastates a country's economy. And in this case, populism is more of a strategy for the political parties to win, and it's kind of more cynical, but it doesn't have much substance. What makes a policy populist is that it is used as a short-term strategy to raise popularity. And Erdogan has this a lot, and this kind of electoral economics. In the a year before the election, he has pursued a policy of electoral economics. He spent money as if there was no tomorrow. He raised minimum wages, cheap credits, tax amnesties, cheap housing projects, just you name it. So these policies that he had resisted, for some of them, for instance, early retirement rights, which will destroy Turkey's social security system. He had resisted it for more than a decade. This was a demand coming from the public. I will not go to the details, but seeing that the election is under risk, he gave in and he spent all these monies, which he's now trying to struggle to recover. So this is an electoral economic dimension. And then a second strategy is what we may call as techno-nationalism. In order to appeal to the feelings of the electorate, he went on a series of big mega projects that presents as if Turkey has jumped in the technological scale. The national car, Turkish drones, which are quite popular globally, and new fighter jets, new fleets, the Navy building up new warships. So there is an element of what we call techno-nationalism that could appeal to the feelings of the electorate. And from there, it enables me to switch to the more technical usage of the term, right? This classic definition of Kasmud and others as a thin ideology that has been repeated several times, divides the society along the mass and elites. It's anti-establishment, it's quite moralist, and it's at the essence, it's quite exclusionary. So those who do not support the leader do not share the values of the pure masses. They are corrupt elites or supporters of that corrupt elite. So it's a very polarizing attitude. And techno-nationalism plays a very important place here, because it enables the government to switch the discourse from economics to security by emphasizing all the gains Turkish defense industry made under Erdogan, and attaching that those improvements to Erdogan's own personality and the way that he is actually representative of the demands of the large masses. Techno-nationalism here plays as a very crucial role. And it also enables to criminalize the opposition as for not being national and authentic. That's the term that he and his media has been using over and over again to define the opposition. Not authentic enough, not national enough. So they pretty much questioning their national loyalties. So he has kind of attacked the legitimacy of the opposition rather than opposition's concrete policies, attack their right to oppose him because they are not particularly belonging to the nation's authentic values. And there, of course, he has benefited by two things. One is that his main rival was a member of of a minority group, both religiously and ethnically. So that played very well to portray him as not authentic and not national. And of course, his big control over the media enabled that to spread this line that actually this is not an election between two legitimate actors, but one legitimate national and authentic actor and one illegitimate rival that is supported by terrorist groups, by global conspiracies, by outside powers, but certainly not belonging to this national, is not part of the true nation or true people. And how he can do that after 20 years in power, how he can claim to be fighting against a corrupt elite and represent being an anti-establishment. Here, I think the key is that he raised the level of being anti-establishment from national level to a global level. So he portrays his fight not against national elite anymore, but against a global elite that united in their wish to undermine Turkey's rise to superpower status. So this is the narrative. So there's a Turkey which is increasing in power because it's represented by its own authentic people. It's running from success to success, which is, I mean, he doesn't have much to show most recently, but then we have drones and we have warships. So this techno-nationalism, he's playing on that. But then there are outside powers who doesn't want that. So he established the debate pretty much on a claim that first, Turkey is being opposed by all other global powers, number one. Number two, Erdogan is not just fighting for the well-being of Turkish people, but he is actually, when he speaks for the global, all the global South, basically. He's speaking for the global South against the establishment elite of the world, and also he's speaking for all the Muslims. So he's fighting against Islamophobia globally, and he's fighting against a world system that privileges certain nations only. And one of his slogans that kept being used again and again is that world is bigger than five, which basically refers to the National Security Council. Of course, he insists on that. He publishes books, he propagates about it, and of course, nobody cares about these ridiculous claims that, of course, world is bigger than five, but nobody believes that Erdogan can really change it. But the audience is not the global public. The audience is the domestic politics. The audience, the idea here is to enable him to make the claim that he's still fighting against some dark hidden forces and some corrupt elites, so that he could portray himself, despite all the luxurious life that he is living in, as one of us fighting against the big bad guys. So this never-ending fight against elites and establishment, because it's against global elites and sometimes very ambiguously defined global elites. Who are they? I mean, it's not also tangible either. Interest lobby, financial lobbies. He's fighting against all of these very, very unclear, ambiguous bodies. So if does this mean that we can never defeat him? I'm part of the opposition, so I don't mean it's not wrong to use that we. Well, we were excited before 2023 because he was defeated in 2019 in the municipal elections. Actually, that was what energized the opposition, but failed. Why? Couple of things. First of all, wrong candidate. So populist policies are pretty much about personalistic policies as well. I mean, unlike the autocracies of the 20th century, we have less and less single-party regimes, military dictatorships, or ideological dictatorships. This is more about all personal politics. So in order to counter that, you have to pick the right candidate. Turkish opposition couldn't do that, whereas it did in the municipal elections. The candidate was not appealing, not charismatic, and he belonged to minority religious sect and minority ethnic sect at the same time, which was as a big mistake. Related to that, in order to promote Kılıçdaroğlu, the joint candidate of the opposition, there was this idea that if the opposition unite, we can defeat him. So there's too much emphasis on the idea that the opposition has to unite. If there needs to be a balance here, and if you push this idea of unity too much, then the parties that support the joint candidates started losing their own platforms, because you are bringing in parties with very different ideological and identity dimensions, and if you underline unity too much, they lose their connection with their own party bases. This was the second mistake the opposition made. And the third point, it's not particularly a mistake, but I think it's important. The nature of the elections, the municipal election and the national elections, are very different. So it is much easier to unite in municipal elections without antagonizing your own party base compared to a national election. So in 2019, it wasn't only Turkey, for instance. In Hungary also, the opposition won in the municipal elections. But again, and a couple of other East European countries, I just can't remember, in Poland and in some other places, they won in the municipal elections, but except Poland, all of them lost at the national level election to the populist party. So this gives us a caution that victory in municipal elections do not easily translate into the national level, because it's much easier to unite at municipal elections to undermine identity divisions in municipal elections, because it's about municipal politics, whereas at the national level, identity issues plays much bigger role, and it's much bigger a challenge to unite without antagonizing your party base or the identity cleavage that you are supporting. So I'll stop here and thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Dr. Salim. And you're right. This idea of opposition uniting against a populist is actually feed into the us versus them rhetoric that the populists are projecting. Okay, so I think without any delay, Dr. Zaslove, the first question is for you. It is asked by Yusuf Iftikhar, and he is asking if, given that there is a rise to conservatism, could this potentially lead to some rise of right-wing political parties in Europe? Do you see any rise of right-wing political parties in Europe in near future?
This is a really nice question. I really like this question. Because I sort of underlying what I was talking about, I would say both at the party level, supply side level, but also at the demand side level, within attitudes of voters. This is sort of a hypothesis, or sort of a feeling I have, that there's a change going on, I think. And I'll start with the political parties. I mean, and I think in Italy, this is really interesting. So Meloni is part of this movement where she's really focusing selling herself as a conservative, as a radical conservative. And I think this is really interesting because she's also part of an international network coming out of the United States, and they're really trying to sell this idea of being a radical conservative. And she's been very successful at doing this. And in Meloni's a particular case because she's, has these fascist roots and stuff like this. But she's done this to sort of make herself, acceptable. But I think this is something that I can see that's spreading in other countries in Europe. I think there's a sort of an attempt to sort of reframe. This is the attaching ideology, the idea of what it means to be radical. And I think what we can see, again, on the supply side, but also the demand side, I think we can see an expanding of issues. So where climate has become important, anti-wokeism has become important. So almost in some cases, I see that there's a broadening of issues and moving away from purely immigration. And I think we see this also at the demand side. I mean, I've seen some nice studies. In the Netherlands, there was a nice study of a colleague of mine who was looking at the Forum for Democracy, and they're seeing actually that migration, I mean, the Forum for Democracy is a bit of a different populist party, was not as important as some other issues. So I sort of see that there's a little transformation going on in terms of supply and demand. And so I think this idea about a conservatism, I think is playing a role in this. And I think this is some sort of avenues of future research. Yeah. And I think it ties into some of the other nice topics that the other presentations. I mean, talking about India and talking about nationalism and these kinds of things. So it comes back in there. Yeah.
Okay. And the second question is related to the generalizability issue with the scales, because most of these scales are developed in Europe, and when you try and apply them in non-European context, usually you face issues. So how to handle that?
Yeah, I mean, it's a very nice question. I think this is a problem we have in general with scales, the extent to which they can travel. I mean, what I've seen that the demand side scales, at least between the studies I've seen between Europe and Latin America, and I saw a couple of studies in Asia, they travel fairly well. But then again, I mean, we were doing some invariance tests in Europe, and even within Europe, there are some issues there. So I mean, I think it's a problem or a challenge with all kinds of scales. I would just sort of I would encourage caution, and I would encourage more collaboration. I mean, if we're really measuring populism, if we're really these definitions should travel, and the scales should travel as well. I mean, I think that's a question. On the other hand, I mean, I am a firm believer in the aspect that populism is a latent construct, and if it's a latent construct, then a lot of the indicators are also in some sense, I mean, proxies for larger latent concepts. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, these are, I'm not having a definite answer here, but I think these are really cool further avenues of research. And I think something like this, where we're talking about more avenues of the world, this is something nice to further collaboration, to further develop these scales and also see the predictability of these scales as well. So I can only agree that this is an issue that's further challenges for research.
So thank you, Dr. Zaslove. You have.
Can I ask two questions before I go, and then you don't have to answer them? But just so if I have to leave for the other presentations, just very quickly. I was interested. Sure. I mean, I was very interested with the psychology papers, because I was thinking, I mean, I'm really interested in what psychologists think about stability of psychological traits, and then the links with populism. So I was thinking, of Bert's presentation and disagreeableness. And so I don't know. I was just wondering how psychologists think about this, or political psychologists. If we have stable traits, what does that say about the links with populism? If we say that populism fluctuates, or is that something about the way that populists activate these characteristics? That was just one question. And the second question for Jennifer, what I really liked about her presentation was this
Bert, if you
this positive aspect of populism. I think that often gets missed. I mean, a colleague of mine, Bram Sprout, he always says populism is also a politics of hope. And I think that this is something that gets really missed. And I know that people like in Italy, people like Pepe Grillo and these kinds of people were able to sort of combine hope, but also humor in these kinds of things. And I think this is something that gets missed. So I don't know, just a comment. But I really like that. And I think that's something that we could think about further. But then again, I'm wondering, how does this mix with the disagreeableness, right? I mean, and this sort of thing, which we also see. Anyway, just some comments. And the other, before I leave, because I want to say the other two presentations I really liked. I really liked the diversity, the idea about nationalism, and then this idea of Turkey, where you have this insider-outsider tension, but at an international level. Anyway, I just wanted to say that before I leave. Thank you very much. This was a very interesting panel.
Thank you, Dr. Zaslove, for being here. Thank you. Okay. I think we can start from the question Dr. Zaslove has asked. So if you can answer that.
You don't have to answer my questions right away. I just wanted to put.
Very briefly, I think, Andrej, I think there are two answers to this. One is, it might indeed be activation, so the degree of rhetoric might vary. You need panel data. I've never really gotten around to do it. With the Dutch case, you could actually do it. Yeah, I don't know. Maybe I'm pursuing other shiny objects at the moment, but it is worth to pursue. The other is, I don't think any social scientist or scholar of political behavior would say that there's this one single monocausal explanation. So, well, maybe what I've outlined here might maybe be more some of the stable links, but then there are other parts that might explain some of the bigger fluctuations. And then it's up to also the community and individual researchers to decide, what is more important or not, right? But so this is the more nuancing answer to it. The first part is maybe indeed in the activation. So there might be a latent proclivity to it, but it might also be then also the natural limit, right? So there's not endless numbers of low agreeable people. So if that is a link, right? So it's so to unite the common good people against all the corrupt elites will not really work out. But yeah, I have multiple research ideas that I've never gotten around to, and this is one of them. Talking to you now, Andrej, also makes me realize that it might be worth putting a student on this one day again.
I mean, just one observation. I know your first paper, you said it was highly correlational, the data, but I saw something really interesting. So, I mean, the Podemos, they weren't disagreeable, but the Linke was. But I was also thinking, Podemos is also a different kind of a left-wing populist party than the Linke. I mean, in terms of, when we're talking about activation, right? So I mean, so I think there's something there that was really cool. I was just thinking, why is it in some sense? But you have to be careful with your confidence intervals in the data. But it was just something I saw there, which I thought was about the activation. Anyway,
I think also panels like this make me realize that we need more comparative data that starts with underlying similar sampling schemes, and that is, that requires more of a team science approach than individual moles digging their own little channels, as to use an analogy, right, of how many scientists work. But that indeed, I hope meetings like this and networks like you're having here can really help to create some of that, because I think we need that. And if we want to understand these phenomena and its complexity across context, I think this is, especially for political psychology, is crucial, right? It's not just psychology. Like, these people function in a context, and that will have all sorts of interactions that I don't think we have. We are maybe only slowly starting to get a bit of a handle on that.
Okay, Dr. Bert, there is another question for you from Mavish Ahmed, and she's asking that when a populist leader has to really become the embodiment of his anti-establishment ideology, otherwise doesn't a flimsy personality put up only for the sake of voters may fall apart once they get their vote. So maybe do they really need to internalize the message if they are trying to portray themselves as a anti-establishment political leader? I think. if I
honest answer is I don't know, right? Like, do these politicians really believe what they say, or are they partly acting? Yeah, this is beyond what my expertise is. I think there's really interesting work. Like Arlie Hochschild has done work on sort of on this, and some others, and you know, I think Stefan Walgraven in Belgium has been interviewing politicians from many different countries, mostly the West. But it's really difficult to get at, are they now acting? Is it a strategy, or is it, you know, when populists enter a government, that's a case obviously where you could see a little bit like, is this still then is strategically changing? But maybe they've really internalized it or not. I guess I just don't know. And even if you would have access to populists, which I don't really have at the elite level, would they be able to tell you that? Would they want to tell you that? And would they be able to reflect on it, whether it's sincere or not?
And why should it be different for populists and other actors? I always wondered this question, right? We always think that the populists are different than others. Is a real communist a real believe in communism? I don't know. Or whatever, right?
This raises question about this idea of populism being an ideology, because it's more discourse. Because we cannot really judge the ideology of a person. Okay, so this question is from Bakker, but I feel Jennifer might be able to answer this well. So Asif has asked, the right wing and the left wing, how do the rhetoric and policy priorities of right wing and left wing populist parties differ? And in what ways do these differences influence the political landscape and public sentiments? So Dr. Jennifer?
Sure. I was actually about to just quickly jump in earlier in response to Andrej's point around the stability of political dispositions. And just to say that what I appreciate about Bert's work was that I also agree that the personality to ideology link isn't the most interesting one to look at. And in particular, in some work that I'm doing with Lotte Thompson and others at Oslo using the Norwegian twin study, and some other longitudinal work using the Danish registries, we're really looking at the importance of certain basic ideological orientations, especially what you think about inequality and what you think about change, you know, authoritarianism, social dominance orientation, as adaptive strategies for navigating hierarchy. And we think that their heritability can go right down to the core without being mediated through personality. So I think this is effectively a political personality when it comes to how do we navigate hierarchy? What do we think about intergroup inequality? And I think there's a lot of evidence for that, really, especially, you know, including using cross-like panel models, looking at how when you look at something like egalitarianism, that is predicting other attitudes, including policy attitudes, over time more strongly than the reverse. But the study that I wanted to do, the third study in our paper, would really be a bunch of experiments where we then look at the rhetoric that we presented and see the extent to which that is responded to differently based on people who are differently positioned, especially on social dominance orientation, where you populate those in terms of right-wing and left-wing terms. So I suppose that leads on to the question then, which is about the different ways in which things play out in right-wing, left-wing. I mean, I think everyone could speak to this, and in terms of policy priorities, but so maybe just in terms of rhetoric, I could draw on some of the qualitative data to help with that. I think the surprising thing is that right-wing populists aren't just nasty and aren't just sounding nasty, and that's why I wouldn't necessarily have looked to something like agreeableness, for example. I would have looked to kind of what exactly are the relationships that they want to maintain. And, you know, all human psychology is moral psychology. Everything we try to do is really about advancing a sense of the moral self and advancing our group or serving our group in some way, or trying to get ahead within our group. And that's why I think you see this positiveness. You know, you need positive emotion to bring people together, notions of a community, notions of the right, the morally right. And so seeing things in terms of right and wrong, or agreeable or disagreeable, or nasty versus hostile doesn't help. So, I just thought it was fascinating that it's especially on the right that you see so much positivity. And maybe that's because of the left's tendency to focus on oppression and inequality and problems. and especially to move away, you know, to always want to be moving toward change, whereas the right are more focused on the past and celebrating the past in the case of populism. What's interesting, though, is that it seems that there's this evolution where the left had typically been, you know, talking about inequalities in the present from the point of view of being representing the people against corporate elites. Now, right-wing populist discourse seems to have successfully constructed the left liberal elite, especially educated folks, such as most people here, as the liberal progressive elite. And of course, there you see all the wokeism stuff. In a way that can be quite dangerous, because I think that leads to kind of anti-technocratic and anti-expert and anti-institutional desires. So then, in terms of the left-wing populist parties, I think that's more like old school left-wing class dynamic. I think just kind of ramped up in terms of some of the rhetoric you saw from Bernie Sanders there and Jeremy Corbyn. But it's definitely told as a continuous story of corporate elites deliberately gathering profits at the top and exploiting workers at the bottom. I don't think it's something necessarily so different from classic leftism. It's just that as the whole politics has moved to the center, then that old, more socialist perspective becomes a bit more radical. And so maybe it's using the populist trope as a way of keeping itself going. Sorry, some scattered thoughts that I hope are helpful.
Thank you.
One thing I think is very interesting that you said is, sorry, I just want to say one thing, is that, so you're talking about the way populists sort of evoke this notion of morality and community. So I think this is really interesting, because one thing I'm interested in is why populists are successful at mobilizing and mainstream parties less. And so I wonder if this is something that mainstream parties are shying away from. I always see it in terms of ideology, but from a political psychologist, you're kind of talking about these psychological dimensions. And I thought that was really interesting. And I think mainstream parties miss this. They can't understand why populists are able to mobilize. And I'm just, when you said that, I don't know, wondering what you think about that. Yeah.
I mean, I suppose, yeah, because they're the establishment and the technocrats. And so, you know, what gets left behind as things get more complicated and societies grows larger and bureaucracies get more complicated is the sense of the people get left behind. And I think that also just resonates with kind of, you know, turbocharged neoliberal capitalism as Farhan was discussing. And if you can harness that as something that people are a part of in the way the BJP are doing, great. But for most people in the West, for most of the working classes in the West, they're being left behind by that because of the decline of manufacturing. And so then there's a sense then of, well, you know, what about us? What about our community? What about our sense of place? Can't we resurrect that? Because there was something there that we lost. They just need a narrative to tell that through. And I think that's where the populist narrative could really help with, in a way that makes people feel good, gets them going. I think that Arlie Hochschild's work on the Tea Party demonstrations and how positive they are, I think is where we got some of the ideas for that. Just noticed Bert mentioned her.
Okay, so I think there are no more questions in the chat section. I think it's time to wrap up. And thank you, everyone. And I would request Zehra to give the concluding remarks, and then Johan has some announcements.
Unfortunately, I have to leave, but it was great talking to everybody.
I do too. Thank you very much. Yeah, very, very interesting. This was a very successful online event. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so just to conclude, first I would like to just thank you all for giving me the opportunity to actually say the concluding remarks, and I also apologize to the host of the beginning. I just started delivering my speech because I wasn't really aware of a certain change. Anyhow, just to conclude, I would like to extend my sincere appreciation and thank all our esteemed panelists for their valuable time and for sharing their valuable insights and expertise. The discussion and, of course, the viewpoints that were shared today, they have undoubtedly they've enriched our understanding of populism in regards to its significant implications in the context of electoral politics. And therefore, I also encourage the attendees to kindly reflect on the key and valuable takeaways from today's stimulating conversation. Thank you all once again for your thoughtful engagement, and may the essential learnings of today's valuable session they prove instrumental in collectively contributing towards the positive change in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. This was a great session.
So,
thank you. Bye.
So Johan has to make a few announcements. I will be waiting for that. Johan,
yes, I will. Yeah. I can just repeat what
has already been said, I think this was a very great panel. Thank you everybody for joining us today. On behalf of ECPS, I just want to remind you to please mark your calendars for the next session, which will take place on Thursday, November 30th, again at 10 to 12 a.m. Central European time. The next panel will be on democracy in Thailand, navigating populism and authoritarianism. So please remember to register once again if you are interested. And as you may have heard already, the ECPS has a workshop on May 16th next year. The topic will be elections and migration. If you are interested, if you want to contribute anything, please submit your extracts by the end of this month, and also feel free to spread the word. Thank you very much, and have a nice rest of the day, everyone, and enjoy your weekend.